Sorry about that. I had a YouTube link open elsewhere, so it was echoing. I apologize.
No
So
worries.
hello and welcome everyone. We're going to be. I'm joined here by two scholars, Dr. Timothy McGrew and Dr. Lydia McGrew, who are here to talk to us about the evidence for the resurrection, and we are going to be doing a live Q&A and panel discussion. So if you'd like to ask a question of our scholars today, you can do so by entering a question in the live chat. I also have some pre-submitted questions that I'm going to be asking also. We will begin just by introducing our guest scholars today. So do you want to maybe say a little bit about your background and where you're coming from in regards to this topic?
Sure. So I am a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. I've been interested in these issues since I was in high school. And like many young people who are raised in a Christian environment, I had my questions about how well established the central historical claims of the Christian faith were. Fortunately, I discovered that they are very well historically anchored, and that began a lifelong interest in this. I went off to graduate school to study epistemology and took a special interest in skeptical arguments, which of course have their applications in history and theology and apologetics, as well as in the philosophy of science, which is an area in which I've specialized. And later, I began to take an interest again in the apologetic issues, and Lydia and I have been thinking and talking and writing and speaking on these issues extensively now for a few decades, actually.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So maybe we could start with some of the epistemological issues that relate to the case for the resurrection. Both of you are very much engaged with epistemological discussions, and Tim especially has done a lot of presentations on a popular slogan that we often hear when trying to make the case for the resurrection, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And of course, that slogan was put forward by the famous popular science communicator and astrophysicist Carl Sagan, but it really goes back to David Hume, who was a famous Scottish philosopher who basically put forward his arguments against establishing a miracle as the best explanation. Do you want to speak to that? Because it's a very common rejoinder to the case for the resurrection. I think it would be good to short circuit that before moving into the actual case for the resurrection.
Sure. So I think the first thing to do is to note that the slogan is simply not free from ambiguity. And if we are to look at the slogan and say, all right, all this means is that if you have a lot to prove, you better have a lot of evidence to prove it. Fine, no problem. And the Christian position has always been, you may require more evidence for this claim than for an ordinary claim, but you may not put it out of the reach of evidence. So that's an innocuous reading of it, and one that Christians are more than happy to come to the table about and discuss. The other reading of it, and this is the reading that derives, I think, ultimately from Hume, is extraordinary claims require more evidence than you've got, whatever you've got, no matter what you've got. And Hume does, I think, maintain that a miracle is by definition beyond the reach of any amount of evidence whatsoever. That's a truly extraordinary epistemological claim. And it is one that Hume does not even begin to back up. The way that he tries to do it is by saying that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. We have the maximum possible evidence for the laws of nature, or we wouldn't call them laws of nature. So whatever evidence you have, it can't possibly be more than the maximum possible evidence. So there's a kind of unequal arm wrestling contest going on there. But all of that is a bit of sleight of hand. It depends on your accepting his initial identification of that as the proper definition. Even the Oxford atheist professor J.L. Mackie finesses that and says, no, a miracle is something that does not happen in the ordinary course of nature, but it is something that is allegedly brought about by some power outside of nature, intervening in nature, which does not typically or routinely do so. So Mackie is alive to the fact that Hume's definition really does seem to be stacking the deck in a way that's illicit. Mackie adapts it, but in so adapting it, he brings it round to something that Christians have often been willing to concede. Not all Christian authors are happy with that, but I am, C.S. Lewis was, William Paley was, and so that's a definition that I'm willing to go ahead and talk about. But once you put it that way, you no longer have the idea that the evidence in favor of the laws of nature is evidence against a miracle. The question is not how does nature behave when it's left to itself? The question becomes, has it in this instance been left to itself? And that's a question that has to be settled on quite different kinds of evidence than the evidence for the regularity of nature when left to itself.
Anything to add to that,
Well,
Lydia?
yeah, so I would add something that I've been trying to do on my YouTube channel. So I've had a YouTube channel since last summer, and I've had a lot of videos about the reliability of the Gospels and miracle claims. So what I'll do is I'll distinguish miracle claims that are particularly strongly established by the evidence of their own documents or their own texts, and miracle claims for which we have to do more routing, as I call it. And I even have a YouTube video on routing from other things that we know or believe about, say, Jesus, who was the person, allegedly doing the miracle. And so in some cases, the text itself is a little bit brief, non-detailed, kind of bare, and it doesn't provide us with as much independent evidence of the miracle in and of itself. So what this leads us to is something that Tim said about an innocuous meaning of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We as Christians, I think, are perfectly within our rights to be fairly skeptical when we approach a miracle claim. And even in a sense, when we sort of put on our skeptic's hat and imagine approaching the Christian miracle claims, we're not shocked at the idea of saying, well, were the disciples faking it? Did someone steal the body? Like considering these alternative possibilities, or was this an elaboration or whatever? And then answering them. So it's not as though we come to it and we're not counseling credulity. We're never saying, well, somebody says it, then I should believe it. Now, a allegedly historical account, it's going to have some force, but when it's for a miracle, that's often not going to be sufficient in and of itself. And so I think when we approach something, we can approach even the Christian claims with, in a sense, due skepticism initially, but then the idea is that these are unusually well attested due to, for example, the context in which these claims were made and the attestations were made, and that overcomes that due skepticism, and that makes these claims unusual, very unusual, if not unique, among miracle claims. So extraordinary claims can require extraordinary evidence, and we can even have quite a low prior probability for an actual miracle or paranormal claim, and yet these are unusually well attested.
What do you think is the best way to go about elucidating the prior probability of the resurrection? I know in your Blackwell Companion article, was published in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, you basically argue that the case for the resurrection, the evidential case, is sufficient to overcome even a very small prior probability. But in my experience talking to skeptics, it's very common for them to employ a kind of a frequentist approach where they'll say that resurrections, we've never observed a resurrection occurring, so by definition, it has to be the very least probable explanation. So you can never infer it as a more probable explanation than the type of phenomenon that we have observed in our everyday uniform repeated experience of cause and effect. So how would you respond to that particular way of addressing it?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at this one. There are two things that I would like to say, actually. The first one is that the straight rule of saying, well, what's the proportion of times this has happened divided by the total possible number of times it could have happened is a terrible way to set a probability just by taking that as the fraction. There are many events that we have never observed, but we would be willing to concede had occurred on the basis of moderate amounts of evidence. Take spontaneous proton decay. Spontaneous proton decay is an event which, according to certain physical theories, is something that happens, but extraordinarily rarely. So what have scientists done? They have not said, well, since it's never occurred, no amount of evidence could persuade us that it's occurred, so we'll just ignore it. No, they set up, water tanks underground in isolated locations and put detectors around the rim to see whether perhaps over the course of decades, one of the detectors should pick up on the decay of a proton that would lead to certain kinds of patterns that they could detect with these detectors. It would no doubt be something that we would ask, well, is the detector simply malfunctioning? But that is not the foregone conclusion. So it would really be a science stopper if we used the straight rule that way. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is any event is unique if you describe it with a sufficient amount of specificity. I lost a game of Scrabble, not a unique event. I lost a game of Scrabble to my Aunt Mabel, who was 82 years old and sipping a cup of mint tea on July 22nd. All right, well, you describe it that specifically, then that has never happened before. But so what? You can always find some way of gerrymandering your descriptions so as to make something seem absolutely wildly improbable, but we can do that for ordinary events too. If you go the other direction and you're allowed to just describe it in soft focus, I could describe a miracle as an event in which an adequate cause brings about an effect. Well, nobody thinks that's wildly improbable as such. So there's a lot that goes into the way that someone is allowed to frame it. And we have to be careful when we're talking with people to walk the line between credulity, saying, oh, this is just like any other event. I would just take any minor amount of evidence as tipping me over. I don't think that's appropriate. And saying, on the other hand, oh, this is just so strange that no amount of evidence could do it. Certainly, it's being unprecedented, if it were unprecedented, would not by itself be a sufficient case for that. So that's just some really bad epistemology that I think pretty nearly all philosophers of science have now abandoned when we're doing the history of science. We don't use a straight rule like that. We just say, no, come on, that's passé.
I would say, especially when we're dealing with agents, that kind of straight rule approach is really poor. People do all kinds of unique things. I can think of things where I would say, so I'm going to use a funny example here. Jonathan, I saw a video of you recently dancing. Now, I would previously have said it was really improbable that Jonathan McClatchy would dance.
Especially on video.
Especially on video. Yeah, just based on what I knew about you. But I saw the video and it happened. So it happened, So agents do unusual things. Now, you can say, well, people dance. Well, yeah, but I knew certain things about you that I would have thought that would be kind of that would you would not want to do that. So we have to come at this in a more nuanced way. So as far as the prior probability, there are a lot of things, and this is where arguments for the existence of God come in. This is where I would say C.S. Lewis's liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma is actually relevant to the prior probability of the resurrection, and is independent. You'll notice that doesn't bring the resurrection evidence in at all, and this is maybe not noted often enough. Messianic prophecy, which I know is an area of your interest, Jonathan. So there are a lot of things, especially if you take it right up through the day of Jesus' death, which is what we celebrate today, Good Friday, and prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus' death, that can be relevant to that prior. I don't believe that you have to raise the prior to some especially high level, because I think the unique evidence for the resurrection is so strong it can overcome a low prior. But it's fine. I mean, we want ultimately to bring in all of our evidence, including this other evidence that's relevant to the prior. And the skeptics who are trying to do some kind of straight rule thing like that, obviously they're not doing that, so that's inappropriate.
Let me just say one more thing about this. When we're looking at the probability, the antecedent probability of a miracle, I think I like the way that William Paley puts this in the preparatory considerations to his book, A View of the Evidences of Christianity. He says, look, take the probability, be it great or small, of the conjunction of two things: that there is a God, and that he wishes to communicate in some manner with his finite creatures in a way that cannot be mistaken for the mere workings of the nature that he has created. At that point, how can he do it except by a miracle? Mm-hmm. Write a beautiful poem, but we have gifted poets who write beautiful poems. Write a striking book of philosophy, but we have talented philosophers who have written striking things. He's got to do something that nature and human effort by themselves cannot do. That's how God announces his presence, by the act of sovereignty. So take that probability, be it as great or as small as you could reasonably set it, given whatever evidence you have. The probability of a miracle cannot be lower than that. Now, that does give us a place for the role of arguments for the existence of God to come in, although in some cases I think it's not necessary to go through those arguments before presenting the historical case. A lot depends on the context. So you need to find out, this person I'm speaking with, where's he coming from? What needs to be done in order to move the argument forward here? And that's a good argument for listening if you want to present your case, listening carefully and finding out what the person needs at that time.
I want to make one more point about the prior that I think may serve as a good bridge here. I believe that, as Tim just hinted in his citation of Paley, Christianity has as part of its content what you might call a meta-level statement, which is that God is communicating theological truth in a way that man can know, and in a way that man can be justified in believing. And that he has done so by way of attesting, prophets and Jesus as his son and so forth. And then they teach things. They teach contentful theological propositions, and then that God has sort of placed his imprimatur on them by way of miracles. I think that's part of the content of Christianity. It's certainly part of the content of traditional Orthodox Christianity. If you start out by saying that is impossible, it's literally impossible for contentful theological propositions such as the Trinity or that Jesus is the unique Son of God or something like that to be confirmed by way of historical propositions about miraculous events, then that isn't just a statement about evidence. That's actually a priori presupposing the falsity of traditional Orthodox Christianity, and that's not keeping an open mind. So if you say that's a category error, that can't happen, well then okay, now we've got a zero probability for prior probability for Orthodox Christianity, and a zero prior probability can't be moved. It's zero. It's zero. That's just true in probability. You can't budge zero. So that's, I think, inappropriate. And so it is important to make sure, if you're going to start talking to someone, that he doesn't take that position of such an immense split between theology and history that nothing you can say is going to confirm particular theological propositions.
Right. We could call this the Acts 26:26 principle. These things were not done in a corner.
And also, one other point I would make there is that just because the prior probability of any random miscellaneous person rising from the dead might be astronomically small, it doesn't follow necessarily that the prior probability of Jesus of Nazareth specifically rising from the dead is at the same level. And as you pointed out, I think that you can make a cumulative argument from Messianic prophecy, for example, right, that point to, or at least suggest that God plausibly might have motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead. And some of these points of Messianic fulfillment, I think, are difficult to deny. For example, in Isaiah 49, it's also in Isaiah 42, where it speaks about the God making the Messiah a light for the nations, or a light for the Gentiles, that God's salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. And Jesus himself, in the Gospels, he says that the gospel will be proclaimed to all nations, and then the end will come. So the fact that Christianity becomes this dominant global religion that it became is something which seems to be quite probable on the hypothesis that Christianity is true, but on the falsehood of that, it seems that it's quite improbable, especially given that until 313 AD, Christianity was persecuted by the Roman Empire, and Christianity, of course, eventually, after Constantine's conversion in 312, and then you've got the Edict of Milan, which guaranteed religious freedom, and then later in 380 under Theodosius I, you have the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Christianity effectively the state religion of the empire. That's something that seemed, and that basically allowed Christianity to then progress and become this global dominant religion. That, from the perspective of the first century, would have seemed very difficult to imagine, and yet it's something that's highly probable given Christianity is true. And so another example, of course, would be in Daniel 9, which is a plausibly messianic text, where it speaks about the cutting off of the Messiah, of the anointed, and then the people of the ruler who shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, which of course happened within a generation of Jesus, with the destruction of the city and temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. And then, of course, Lydia's published a paper on the fact that Jesus was crucified and various texts related, various prophetic fulfillments relating to Psalm 22. And even if one doesn't think that it's probable that Psalm 22 is a messianic text, I think you can make defensible arguments for that, though I don't think that it's an ironclad argument. But I think that you can find some intertextuality with texts like Isaiah 53, and it seems to be difficult to find Psalm 22 fulfilled in the life of David, for example. But even if you grant that the probability of Psalm 22 is as low as 10% probability or 10% confidence that it is indeed a messianic text and it does indeed describe a crucifixion scene. If the crucifixion of Jesus is as improbable as, say, 1 in 1,000, which is the value that Lydia comes to in her paper on messianic death prophecies, then that's still a base factor of 100, which adds, I think, to the cumulative argument from messianic fulfillment. What do you guys think of that approach?
Well, yeah, and I mentioned messianic prophecy along with the trilemma, and I would like to connect this with the example I gave about Jonathan dancing. So imagine that 3 years ago, okay, or let's go back 5 years, before you had gotten married, right? So it was more improbable then, right? But if we put it in connection with you're being married and then your wife liking to dance and wanting to teach you to dance, then that makes it more probable, right? So we bring in, it's not just, we describe Jonathan in some general terms and he's a nerd and he, kind of quiet and whatnot and so forth. And what's the probability that this type of person would dance on video with a lady? Okay, no, it's the probability that, Jonathan specifically, who's married to Katerina, etc. Okay, so that's kind of what you're doing with the messianic prophecies. You can approach the evidence in an incomplete way that will make it seem really improbable that something will happen. But then when you know more about the person, then it makes more sense. And so I think that this is true of Jesus as well.
Good. So let's maybe, and also one final point I'll make there is in Isaiah 53, verse 10, and also in various places in the New Testament, both Messianic prophecy and Jesus predict that the Messiah would be raised from the dead, and that would be the ultimate vindication of Jesus' Messianic identity. And therefore, the fact that he would be raised from the dead is highly probable given that he is the Messiah, and we also have independent reason to believe him to be the Messiah, which therefore is relevant to the probability. So let's maybe transition to talking about a scholar that I know Lydia has interacted with quite a bit, namely Dale Allison. Lydia mentioned recently Dale Allison's perspective that although a worldview can make one more open to the idea of a miraculous occurrence, a miraculous occurrence can't provide support, confirmatory support for one's worldview. Do you want to maybe speak to that, Lydia or Tim?
Right. Well, he talks about this in his new book. I've just gotten hold of his new book, and I think the last I got a copy, and I've been reading it. So it's in that sense I've been interacting with him a lot. I had not previously, but and I also watched all the video were interesting a few months ago, and he actually says, he calls it a category error. He uses the word alchemical. So of course alchemy is fake, there is no such thing. So he calls it alchemical to think that history, and he says including the history of the time following Jesus' crucifixion or the days following crucifixion, to think that history can have an impact upon a proposition like that God exists or a specific God exists. That's just alchemical. It's a category error. Now this was part of what I was leading into a couple of minutes ago when I said, in essence, that is to give traditional Christianity a prior probability of 0. And that is to be closed to evidence. And what's interesting is that Dr. Allison is trying to be fair. He's presenting this approach as this is how we're fair. We're not giving privilege, any, prior privilege to any one religion over another. We're trying to follow the evidence where it leads. But actually, if you rule out a priori the possibility that a specific miracle would confirm a specific religion, he doesn't seem entirely close to the idea that a miracle or paranormal event of some kind might confirm something super broad, like weird things happen in the world, or there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy, or the world is an odd place, or something like that. But then that's just kind of a big basket that's going to include Christianity and other religions and so forth. What he seems to be close to is the idea that we might call an exclusionary religious claim could be supported by historical data. So then all through the book, it's very interesting to see, just in the parts I've read, he'll say, well, then if you're more open to the resurrection, you should be more open to this religious claim in another, a miracle claim in another religion. And conversely, if you think that this miracle claim in another religion is false and you prefer a skeptical scenario, then you should think that a skeptical scenario is more and more probable in the Christian claim. And over and over, he does this like more times than I can count, trying to block any principled objection to carrying that evidence over in that way. And I think that's actually, in a sense, arising from a presupposition of the falsity of traditional Christianity, which ironically is closed-minded when he's attempting to be open-minded.
Sorry, anything to add to that, Tim?
No, I think that's admirably clear. The point is, if by saying that you might be made more open to a resurrection, Allison means anything rational, then literally he cannot consistently also say that evidence for a resurrection is not evidence that can have any bearing on the worldview issues. That if open simply meant psychologically and irrationally, well, then bets are off, but it's a really uninteresting claim at that point. But he wants to say something stronger. He wants to say something that can block a certain move that he knows his dialectical opponents want to make. And once he has said that, there is only one interesting reading of the claim. And on that reading, it is false. I understand that Allison, like many people who have worked in philological fields, is not accustomed to thinking mathematically, not accustomed to thinking in probabilities. And I certainly would not say that anyone has to be explicit about that to do good work. Many people have done good work without thinking mathematically. But when you say something that is mathematically impossible, then those who have some expertise in probability need to speak up and to say, no, I'm sorry, you just can't have it both ways there. It's a two-way street if it's a street at all.
And as Lydia has also pointed out before, it's actually almost backwards, because the proposition of theism, it only raises the probability of the resurrection in a very minor or small way, in the same way that if I hypothesize that there's someone called Tim, that only raises the probability slightly that I'll receive an email from Tim sometime today. Whereas
Right.
if I receive an email that seems to be from Tim, then that is very good evidence that Tim actually exists. And so it's, yeah.
We do get these evidential asymmetries.
Right.
So there are asymmetries where A is only slight evidence for B, and B is very strong evidence for A. So if someone who wanted to take Allison's position wanted to sort of retrench and sort of say, okay, let's not say it's a category error, let's not say it's a alchemical or whatever, and sort of withdraw that, then he could say, well, it's only very little evidence. The evidence for the resurrection is only very little evidence for, say, a theistic worldview, whereas a theistic worldview is very important to making you rationally open to a miracle, and that the asymmetry goes that way. But I actually think if we have an asymmetry, and I think we do, it goes the opposite way, as you've just stated.
Sure. Do you want to maybe also talk about Allison's parallel of Buddha's rainbow bodies and what he has to say about that? Because he said something to the effect of that he'd like to see a Bayesian analysis of rainbow bodies. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I just read that. I read that chapter yesterday. Also, I wanted to say that the statement, I'd like to see a Bayesian analysis of rainbow bodies, comes up in his Interacting with Us, which he does for, just like a couple paragraphs. It's not very long. And I think this arises from Dr. Allison's failure to understand that we are not counseling credulity. And so that was something I said in the lead-in, that we're not saying, okay, we believe that you should just believe what people tell you, and the disciples said that Jesus was raised from the dead, so we should believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, or something like that. So with the rainbow bodies, it's interesting because he keeps saying, well, people are dismissing them and they haven't considered the documents. They're dismissing them. That's very prejudiced. You haven't considered the documents. So then he has these quotations throughout his chapter of, supposedly the documents that he's talking about. Now, I admit, I've just read his quotations, but supposedly, presumably, he thinks these quotations are representing something of the strength of the case, and they are really just assertions. They're assertions like, to the effect, something of this kind. This person died, and he said, before he died, don't touch my body for 7 days. And so, his body was under a cloth, and for 7 days, we didn't touch it, but we could tell that what was under the cloth was getting smaller and smaller. And then we uncovered it on the 7th day or the 8th day, and there was nothing left but hair and fingernails, and there had been a rainbow seen over the house. Okay, and then he's got variants on this. Sometimes the body's gone altogether. Sometimes the body is locked up in a room, and then the room is opened at the end of the time and it's gone. Sometimes there's no hair and nails. Sometimes the claim is that they found it and it was very shrunk and so forth. And that's what he has, okay? And then he'll say, well, this was the person's son, or this was this came out within 2 years, or statements to that effect, that it would have been someone who would have been in a fairly close position. And apparently he thinks that's in some way comparable to the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And I just find that astounding, because as I was hinting before, a Bayesian analysis has to take into account these social contexts. So I'm perfectly willing to walk into the evaluation of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and say, okay, let's consider that someone faked it. Like I often consider fraud to be like at the top of my list, like a priori. I don't mean in a specific case, but just people tell lies all the time. They really do, especially in religious contexts, Elvis sightings or whatever, that people just want to make themselves interesting, or whatever. And I'm willing to walk into Christianity with that question, but because they were risking what they were risking in those early days when they were presenting this, that is very, very improbable. Whereas, quite frankly, the people that Dr. Allison is describing here do not appear to have been risking a single thing. He doesn't give any indication that they are risking any kind of really bad thing happening to them just by generally saying. Now, sometimes the communist government sort of cracks down, and he mentions this in Tibet, that they don't want this widely proclaimed. But by just sort of saying it to the friends or the people immediately around, or writing out a document or something, it doesn't sound like anybody's gotten into big trouble for that. So, okay, why not fraud? And he says, well, that's too easy. No, I don't think that is too easy. I think we should be very open to that, because people do tell a lot of lies. But I think we have an answer to that in the case of Christianity. And another thing I want to mention is that this idea of a rainbow body appears to be well established in Buddhism so people are very predisposed to believe it. Nobody's hostilely questioning it. So I said to Tim ahead of time, be prepared to quote that great quotation about a religious miracle claim within an established religion. So I'll stop now and let Tim do that.
Sure. Well, this comes from William Adams' book, An Essay in Answer to Mr. Hume's Essay on Miracles, because, of course, famously in the second part of his essay of miracles, Hume had raised several other miracle claims, much like Allison saying, well, if you don't believe these, then you shouldn't believe any others. Wink, nod. He means the miracle of the resurrection. And his contemporaries really took him to the woodshed on this. So William Adams says there is a wide difference betwixt establishing false miracles by the help of a false religion. He means a false religion already established. And establishing a false religion by the help of false miracles. Nothing is more easy than the former of these, or more difficult than the latter. The point is simply that, as I sometimes put it, if you wanted to start a new religion, you're up against something rough, and the more hostile the audience, the worse it is. If I offer to buy you a one-way ticket to go start your new religion, and I'll offer you a ticket either to Minneapolis or to Mecca, where do you want to go? Minneapolis, your odds might be good, they might not be good, but in Mecca, you'll be dead before you hit baggage claim. A hostile audience is a severe test for the founding of a new religion. They are not at all predisposed to think that you're working a miracle. They're likely to try to think of any excuse to deny it. And in fact, even if they feel like they can't get around it, they may still retain their hostility toward you. Have a look at the way that we're told the Jewish leaders responded in John 12 to the news of Lazarus' resurrection from the dead. Well, it's hard to deny miracles happened here, so let's kill him again and make sure he stays dead this time. So this distinction really does have considerable importance. When I debated Bart Ehrman on the Unbelievable show, Bart wanted to bring up the stories about the Baal Shem Tov as parallels for the miracles of Christianity. And I said, where's the hostile audience? And it had clearly never occurred to him, bless his soul, that a hostile audience would make any difference whatsoever in the epistemic evaluation of the claims. So he just sort of blustered and said he didn't understand what I was talking about. I believe that he didn't understand it, at least at first, but he's a bright guy. He should catch on pretty quickly. A hostile audience provides a severe test for the establishment of a new religion that flies in the face of the things that that audience wants to maintain by means of a miracle claim. They are very unlikely to acquiesce in it unless there's an awful lot of evidence that it is in fact a miracle. And even so, some of them may remain resistant.
So just putting on my skeptic hat for a moment and playing devil's advocate, someone might argue that Islam, of course, flourished at first, at least to begin with, in the face of a hostile environment. But I think your response there would be that there were no miracles associated with the founding of Islam, right?
Right. Until the Hadith, which we began to see collected more than a century after the events of the founding of Islam. And the Quran repeatedly states that Muhammad worked no miracle. If you want a miracle, all you're going to get is the beauty of the language of the Quran itself. Try to write a chapter like it if you don't think so. But that's really not a parallel at all for the miracles of the New Testament. Muhammad seems to have been conscious of the fact that trying to put one over on an audience that wasn't predisposed to agree with him was going to be hard. So after the initial 10 years of moderate preaching, when Muhammad decided, all right, let's kick this into high gear. He had made what, about one convert a month, many of them members of his own extended family. For those 10 years, he had about 100 converts at that time. Then he went to war, and Islam exploded. It flourished at the point of a sword. So did Christianity in a manner of speaking, but the sword was pointed the other direction. And that makes all the difference.
Sure, very good point. So someone submitted a question in the live chat, which was, can you employ a consistent set of standards to affirm the resurrection and reject other non-Christian miracle claims? Are there concrete test cases that could be discussed as comparison?
Sure. So I like what John Douglas does in his work, The Criterion. This was one of Hume's contemporaries, actually writing before Hume's death in 1776. Douglas, who I believe was Bishop of Salisbury, says there are several criteria that we can employ that render miracle accounts doubtful. He does not say the miracle accounts must be false if they bear these marks of doubt, but they are not promising places to start. One of them is if the only reports that we have of it occur quite a bit later than the event was supposed to have occurred. So the miracles attributed to Muhammad in the Hadith begin to emerge only a century and more after his death. There's an example of that. He says a miracle claim may reasonably be doubted when it is first made only at a great distance from the place where it is said to have been worked. Some of the claims about Apollonius of Tyana, made by Philostratus in his Life of Apollonius, are published in Rome, and their claims of miracles worked in India. This is a very long way off. There's no prior record of any of these claims. And the third is if they might have been allowed to pass without examination at the time when they were first reported, even if they were reported close to the time and in the place. And that passing without examination brings us back to the question of a hostile audience. So if you push miracle claims through these filters and you say, what emerges as a plausible place to start? The answer is very little. And that would include many of the miracle claims of Christian ecclesiastical history, which were wrought in a context where people were apt to be fervent believers in the truth of Christianity. And I have no problem saying, you know what, that does reduce their plausibility ab initio. But what this means is if there are very few miracle claims that actually survive these tests, and you'll notice that the tests make no reference to this or that particular religion. They refer to space and time and context, and that is all. Then what you're left with is a very, very small handful of things indeed. And the resurrection stands head and shoulders above all of the others as the one for which we have the most contemporaneous evidence and the most evidence that bears on it in every direction. So it's not a bit of special pleading to say, yes, there are tens of thousands of miracle claims out there, but not all of them are equally promising places to start. It's not special pleading to say, start here, because I'm not saying start here because I feel like it. I'm saying start here because this is a place where we have something that has survived filtering through these reasonable topic neutral criteria that other miracle claims do not.
I think there may be a confused idea that we need to have tests that avoid equally false negatives and false positives. And so what Tim has just laid out from Douglas's The Criterion may have what we might call false negatives. You know, that you could have true miracles that would fail in a sense, fail one of those tests. But we're not saying that we're going to find all the miracles, that are true, that are out there, and then avoid all the claims that are false. So one way to look at this is that if we have a severe test, we're making the false positive rate low, possibly at the cost of making the false negative rate somewhat higher. And for that reason, too, I think we need to distinguish between miracle claims that I believe to be true and miracle claims that I believe to be true as a premise of my argument for my religion. And this is where epistemic routing is so important. If I, for example, suppose that I take a miracle in the book of Acts where it says that Peter raised Dorcas from the dead. I hadn't even thought of that before we had this discussion. I just now picked it out of a hat, as it were. It's a pretty brief description, and it's our only account of it, and so forth, that there was this woman named Dorcas, and she died, and she made all these little clothes, and they showed it to Peter, and it's a very sad story, and then he took her by the hand and raised her from the dead. I'm more inclined to accept that, and I think rationally so, because I believe I have other evidence for Christianity. But I'm not going to claim that account in Acts of the raising of Dorcas is very strong independent evidence at all for the truth of Christianity. So if you ask me, do I believe that Peter raised Dorcas from the dead? I'll say yes. Do I believe that God raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead? I will also say yes. But those two miracles stories are playing very different roles in my total epistemological view. And the one is evidence, quite strong evidence for the other, but the Dorcas is not particularly strong evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So that's where I think when somebody says, do you have a test, we need to make it clear that we're actually deliberately trying to make a test more severe in such a way that we are going to, I think, legitimately and reasonably question some things if we come at it without, taking into account our independent evidence for that religion, and that's fine. That's legitimate, and yet the resurrection of Jesus survives that kind of test.
Absolutely. Would you agree with me then that there are certain propositions in Scripture about which we can be more confident about than other propositions? That's not to say that we deny ones that we're less confident about, but there are certain propositions that have more evidence supporting them than other propositions.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I would agree with that. I would just say, however, to forestall misunderstanding, I am not saying that because, for example, I think that John often chose to sacrifice accuracy on the ground level of historical reportage in the pursuit of some higher theological accuracy. So I would not say that because I think that there are passages in the Gospels that are particularly doubtful. And that is something that some people who would say, yes, some things are better established or better evidence than others might mean by it, and I would not agree with that. What I would say is it's just the pedestrian fact that, yes, of course, there are things some things are better established than others. I think I'm going to have ribs for dinner because I think I saw them out on the counter in the kitchen, and I can't imagine why else they would have been. But I am more confident that I'm married to Lydia than I am that I'm going to have ribs for dinner tonight. Maybe the oven will malfunction, right? I mean, I'm perfectly confident, in fact, in both propositions, but one of them is better attested than the other. And this is something that comes up again in Scripture. Now, if you have a particular view of inerrancy that is what I call a top-down view, that says you have to sort of latch onto the inerrancy of Scripture first, make that an inviolable precept that's not driven by evidence from below, but is sort of instituted by worldview from above, then I suppose you would be uncomfortable with that claim. But I don't intend it to be some kind of wildly skeptical claim or even somewhat skeptical claim. It's just really almost a truism about evidence. Yeah, you're going to have somewhat better evidence for some things than others. So am I convinced Jesus rose from the dead? Yes. Am I convinced that Jesus raised the son of the widow of Nain? Yes, but not independent of the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, which is actually sort of a more fundamental point. And that on the basis not of other miracle claims, but of historical attestation of a kind that we do in any historical investigation. Whereas the resurrection of the son of the widow of Nain bears very little negligible epistemic relevance to my belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And in fact, in our very long article on the resurrection of Jesus, we didn't even bother to talk about that particular thing.
It's interesting because I talked recently to a very staunch inerrantist. It's not the first similar conversation I've had. And he's also very committed to the classical approach to apologetics. Sure. And so I asked him, is there not a little bit of an inconsistency there? Because if everything's equally probable, which was the position that he took, if he's equally confident about every verse, every proposition of Scripture, then in what sense is there talking about evidence? Because evidence, by definition, is going to change the probabilistic landscape. So it's an inconsistency that I think a lot of people miss.
I think with that very strong inerrantist approach, so just like I said that 0 can't budge, 1 also as a probability can't budge. So if you say that every proposition in Scripture has probability 1, then of course they're all equal, and some of them can't be raised any higher because 1 is as high as it gets, So then we're not going to say that some of them are more probable than others because they're all 1, and I don't think that's accurate.
Sure. I think perhaps this is a good time to maybe just summarize very briefly in a nutshell the case for the resurrection. And so the way that I would express it, and I really like the way that Tim and Lydia have formulated, which I understand is derived from the way that William Paley would construct the argument, would be to say that, to postulate that we do indeed have testimony that comes from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus was raised from the dead and appeared to them, and that the content of their claims makes it enormously improbable that they were deceived into believing Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. And the circumstances of their claims makes it enormously improbable that they were deceiving others into believing that Jesus rose from the dead. And therefore, the most probable explanation is that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead. Because when anyone makes a claim, there's 3 and only 3 possible categories of explanation that could account for that. One is that they lied about it. One is they were honestly mistaken. One is that they were correct. And so the way that I would, and I think the way that all of us would go about establishing that the content of their claims make it enormously probable that they were deceived honestly, are that when you look at the nature of the Gospels and Acts, and we've established, I think, quite convincingly, that those claims goes back to eyewitness testimony. It portrays the gospel appearance, the resurrection appearances in the gospels as involving not just sight, but other sensory modes, including auditory and hearing and physical contact and group conversations with Jesus and eating breakfast with Jesus, even on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And according to Acts 1, it was extended to a whole 40-day time period and so forth. And so that's the sort of thing that's very difficult to be honestly wrong about. And then compounding that, you look at the fact that that Jesus is identified by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 as the first fruits from among the dead, which of course is connected to the Feast of First Fruits, which according to Leviticus 23 was to be celebrated on the day following the first Sabbath following Passover, which would make it the Sunday. And Jesus, of course, is the first fruits from among the dead in the sense that his resurrection is the guarantor of the general resurrection at the end of time, just as the first fruits of the harvest were the guarantor of the remainder of the harvest that was to be gathered. And so it seems to me that that points to design. The fact that Jesus' resurrection just happens to coincide with the Feast of First Fruits, given the theological import of that points to design, either on the part of humans that deliberately fudge the story to make it comport, or on the part of the divine. Either way, it points against the hypothesis of being honestly mistaken. And so then we come to evaluate the remaining hypothesis that Jesus really did, the remaining hypothesis that they lied about it. And I think that the fact that the apostles were willing to suffer and die as martyrs, the fact they were willing at least to suffer labors and dangers and trials in account of their claim that Jesus rose from the dead, at least that fact that William Paley alludes to is very well established and uncontroversial. The extent to which the apostles died and exactly why they were dying is more controversial, but the fact that they were willing to die, at least it's more probable given sincerity than the falsehood of that. So anything to add to that, either of you?
It's a considerably more plausible. That this brings to mind something often quoted from Chuck Colson, where he says, look, I know what it's like to be on the inside of a conspiracy. And 10 or a dozen of the most powerful people in the nation couldn't keep a lid on this Watergate thing for 3 weeks. And nobody was threatening to take them out and nail them to a cross. Let's just get really down to the base level here. That has a tendency to focus one's mind wonderfully. There's a scene in the movie The Princess Bride where they're trying to storm a castle, and the warden of the gate pretends that he doesn't have the key. And I think it's Inigo just says to the giant Fezzik, rip his arms off. Oh, you mean this key, he says, and he pulls out the key, right? When you're threatened with immediate dismemberment or crucifixion, you tend to change your mind quick if you're dissembling or if you think you might have been mistaken in some respect. The earliest Christians faced an environment in which the political authorities and the religious authorities had just successfully conspired to have their rabbi crucified. They had to know what would be the likely outcome. The least they could expect would be that they would endure labors and dangers and sufferings on account of the accounts that they were delivering. And so, of course, that's an enormous deterrent. When the Bar Kokhba rebellion took shape early in the 2nd century and was crushed by Rome, people didn't even want to admit that they had known Simon ben Kosoba, the Messianic pretender. They said, no, I never knew the guy. That was their reaction. They did not go out into the streets and proclaim that Simon ben Kosoba had come back from the dead. They wanted nothing whatsoever to do with it. That's a very human reaction. Something transformed the earliest witnesses to Christianity from people who quite understandably were timid and in hiding to people who were just unaccountably bold unless what they said was what they sincerely believed.
So I love that trilemma version of it that you just did, Jonathan, and I think it's really important. And I want to say 2 things about that. First of all, the content of their claims. So not to keep on ragging on Allison, but he has this phrase that he uses that Jesus' tomb was vacant because his corpse became transformed and entered a new state of existence. I'm reading that. That's directly from his book. And he uses that as an attempted summary of the claim of Jesus' resurrection. I beg to differ. That is not what the disciples claimed because it's much too vague. They did not merely claim that his corpse was transformed and entered a new state of existence. They claimed that he bodily rose from the dead and that he was in front of them and that they, that they could touch him and that he was walking around among them. In discussing the rainbow bodies claim, he has one of the examples where he says they claimed, some of the people, the disciples of one of these Tibetan gurus, claimed to have seen him after his resurrection, so that he's got a little Q&A that he actually quotes from some of the documents, and it says they saw him in a dream or they saw him in a vision. Well, Peter and the others did not claim merely to have seen Jesus in a dream or a vision. They claimed to have seen him, actually walking around in a sense such that he would have left footprints on the ground. So that's really important, that as Christians, we define that content of their claim, and then we support that. I mean, I'm not just saying, hey, as Christians, we have to say this. I'm saying I think that's historically supportable, that the content of their claim was far more robust than just that his corpse was transformed and entered a new state of existence. So that's important for that idea of there not being honestly mistaken. And then as far as their that other leg of their deceiving, and I think this is also relevant to their being honestly mistaken. I did a blog post sometime within the past year that I was really pleased with, based on an email I had sent someone about the fraud hypothesis. And I discussed independence there, and I brought in some considerations that Tim and I did not bring in our 2009 published article in the Blackwell Companion about independence, specifically independence among the women. And that was something we didn't. We put the women together, and you can, if you want, actually separate the women. Because you have Joanna, you have them named. Luke names several of the women, Joanna and Mary Magdalene, and I believe if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to remember if he names Susanna as one of the ones. Mark names Salome. So we actually have names of the women who supposedly not only witnessed the crucifixion, but then came to the tomb that morning. And we start thinking about their situations in life. And there's this tendency to think of the Christians as forming this unanimous cult with a charismatic leader, maybe Peter or something, who could sort of do this, Jedi mind trick or something and say, you saw Jesus risen from the dead, and they all in unison say, yes, we saw Jesus risen from the dead, or something of that kind. And I think the evidence is very strongly to the contrary. Peter was a follower of a failed messianic claimant. He had himself denied that he knew Jesus just 3 days before, overnight from Thursday to Friday. He went out and wept bitterly after that. He was not in a position to be gathering people together and working a Jedi mind trick on them, nor do we have any evidence that he did so. And in contrast, Joanna's husband, Chuza, the household manager of Herod, he had a position to lose. James, Jesus' kinsman or brother, had a position to lose. He was highly respected in the Jewish community. These were people who would have had other pressures being brought to bear on them. The women, most of, if not all of them, would have had male relatives who would have had some degree of independence from the disciples and would have had an interest in saying, did you really see that? Did that really, would you shut up, please? You're going to get us in trouble. Can't we just go back to being good Jews or whatever? If, because those men didn't, see Jesus at the tomb or see the angel at the tomb and didn't claim to have. So there would be this degree of independence to put stress and pressure both on people who were making fraudulent claims and on people who in some hysterical fashion were overinterpreting some kind of hallucination or emotional experience or even visionary experience they had into a more physical type experience, and to say, let's get clear what exactly happened at that tomb, or what exactly happened in that room, and so forth, and would have had a reason to do that. And so that introduces fractures of the kind that I think Colson has in mind in either a conspiracy or in some kind of mutually confirmatory religious hysteria that's going on to boost or bolster these claims to being something that they are not already. And again, that context of persecution comes into play there. So I think this is important for ruling out those other horns of that trilemma.
So I do have a question for both of you relating to that Blackwell companion piece, and this is one critique that I had of the argument that you made, at least when I first read it, and that is that when you are discussing the appearance to the apostles and you assign each of them a base factor, I forget exactly what base factor you assigned to the appearance to each of the individual apostles, you treat them as independent, and I'm reminded of Arif Ahmed's concern that if someone does a magic trick and fools one person in the audience, then it's automatically more likely that other people are going to be deceived as well. And so it seems that I'd be a little bit concerned about treating them all as completely independent of each other, because if one person is deceived into thinking Jesus rose from the dead, then it becomes more probable that others are as well. What would you say to that critique?
Well, I'd say there's two things that one should keep in mind here. Number one, we say right up front, the numbers are illustrative. It's the point about the accumulation of evidence that's more important. We didn't pick numbers we thought were implausible, but if you have a disagreement about that, or if you think that you want to, say, put in a correction factor for an unduly optimistic independence claim, feel free to do so. But the other point is that as far as they're being sincerely mistaken, that's really hard. That's a very hard sell given the nature of the claim. Right? In a magic trick, you're in the audience, the magician is on stage. You don't get to come up and look over his shoulder or stand behind him as he's pulling off his trick. You don't get to, go through and examine these things. But with the resurrection of Jesus, just exactly how is anyone supposed to have pulled this off in anything like a way that respects the data that we have as to what these people sincerely claimed, whether rightly or wrongly? It's very hard to imagine them being wrong about the fact that their intimate friend was alive again, was speaking with them, was eating with them. You really have to go the direction that many people try to go and say, well, I'm just going to brush aside all of that evidence because that can't be right because Hume or something. The other thing is, if you're going to talk about they're being insincerely faking it, then the things that happened to the individual Christians, the hardships that they endured, and again, I'm not claiming that a majority of them can be established to have met martyrdoms. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. The evidence is very uneven, although in the case of Peter and Paul, it's pretty strong from first century sources. But in the other cases, so maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But nobody walked into this saying, we're going to stick a finger in the eye of the Jewish leadership, which is the community in which Christianity takes its rise in every place that it goes. It's always, preached among the Jews first. If they reject it, they'll turn to the Gentiles. And in the eye of the Romans with their pantheon of gods, all of whom were dismissed as false gods by the Christians. You really have to say, what would you expect? You certainly would not expect a warm welcome. And so once one of these guys had said something which the others knew to be false, what motivation exactly would there have been in the direction of saying, yeah, that makes it more probable the next guy will also say the same false thing? Over a long course of time, not just sort of all at once in the hopes that they can make a collective bluff, but over the course of decades and decades, that is just not plausible. And again, the Colson example does sort of come back to haunt us here, right? They knew that what they were saying was false. They tried to put a bold face on it, and it just collapsed. So I really think if there's a way that the independence breaks down there, it's more likely to break down the other direction. Like, well, you can go hang yourself, but I'm out of here, right? I mean, what's the very statement that we find Peter making in the Gospels? I'm going fishing, right? Go back to life, and the most likely thing to happen if there wasn't a resurrection is nothing. No claims, no stories. People go back just like they did after the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. They just go back to life, and they keep their heads down and try to stay out of the way of Rome and do the best they can. Startlingly, that did not happen with Christianity.
So I would make two two responses too. I would say the persecution of individual people. So, for example, Peter and John are beaten early in Acts. They take them and they beat them. The persecution of some of the witnesses, I think, could also cause people to think twice if their own beliefs are derivative or unjustified. So even aside from fraud on the part of at least some of them, I mean, maybe you'd have fraud by some of them, or a trick or something that's then being carried over convincing others, but or some kind of confusion, I think you would be very motivated to say, wait a minute, how exactly do I know this? So, apply this to, say, the rainbow body. Suppose that you're out there attesting to this thing under the cloth is getting smaller and smaller, and then some kind of terrible thing happens to the first guy who said this, and then you say to yourself, oh, wait, I was taking his word for it. I've been out there saying, yep, this happened. Yep, this happened. And people are listening to me. But actually, I didn't come in there and put my hands all over it and take the cloth off and that. And maybe they're getting the impression that I'm independently attesting to this, and I'm really not. You could be very motivated to start questioning your derivative or unjustified belief in order to distance yourself from a claim that someone else had suffered from. So I think that suffering idea can also be used not only for widespread fraud among them, but also for some kind of vague justification or vague religious thing, like, well, yeah, I didn't actually see that myself, and so forth. So that's one thing. Another thing I would want to say is that there were things that we did not emphasize that are relevant to independence that you could bring in to construct a different kind of independence Bayes factor that I think plausibly could come out to be as high or higher. So suppose you split the women up, okay, which we didn't do, and counted them separately because of the pressures that were on them. Or suppose that you split the different appearances. All right, so in a trick, like a magic trick, that's a one-time gig, right? Everybody's there in the room and they're all watching it, whereas the appearances to the disciples are claimed to have been multiple. So not all even to the same group of people. So we've got different people saying, not only did this happen, we've got Thomas saying, yeah, I wasn't there that first time, and I thought they were nuts, and then later he appeared to me and he invited me to touch him. Or you have the same person saying that different things happened on different occasions. So you've got, let's say, John saying, yes, on that evening he came and he ate with us, or he ate fish or whatever. And then later we were by the Sea of Galilee and we saw this man on the shore, and then we recognized him. We came to shore and he ate with us again, and he gave us this long conversation. So you've got a need for some kind of at least somewhat independent cause for those different claims, sometimes by the same people, sometimes by partially disjoint sets of people. You've got going back to the women, you've got Mary Magdalene and that very detailed account of her meeting with Jesus in the garden. How is that coming about, and so forth. So you can break your independence down in different ways according to numbers of appearances, larger numbers of people. We didn't count the road to Emmaus in our Blackwell Companion. We did nothing with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. We did nothing with that. If I recall correctly, 14th guy, I can't remember his name now, Justice, who was a possibility for replacing Judas, because they said he'd been with them and he knew all the same things, but they wanted to keep the number to 12. And we didn't do anything with that guy, but they were claiming that he had experienced the risen Jesus. We did nothing with the claim of the 500. I realize that's not detailed, but we didn't do anything with it. So there are a lot of other ways of breaking down the evidence that could even bring the numbers of separate attesters up higher in ways that would not be easy to account for by way of some single trick or single confusion or single mental aberration that is affecting all of them at once.
Great, thank you. Let's maybe take two more questions. Okay, so one person asked if you could address the question of how much weight to give Paul's statement about the 500 witnesses in 1 Corinthians 15. Do you think that's an important point to bring out?
I guess I would say it's of some interest, certainly. I suspect that that may actually be a reference to the or an allusion to the same occasion that is recounted, though without those details, in Matthew 28. That's not a certain identification, but it's a plausible one. And I think the main point that I would stress is that Paul is writing trying to persuade people in Corinth, and he obviously has adversaries. The entire tone of his letter is defensive. It's clear that he is trying to defend himself against multiple charges, the charge that he just swayed them with eloquent speech, the charge that he's sort of pilfering money. Paul is very defensive about these kinds of things in his letters to the Corinthians. And so I doubt that he would have made a claim like that, appealing to it as common knowledge. He's not at that point trying to persuade them of its truth. He says, I delivered to you that which I also received. And then he goes into the recitation of the creed. And I think that the 500 witnesses is something that they knew had been taught from the beginning. It is unlikely, I think, that he would have given a handle to them for discrediting him by making such a statement, as eventually they were highly motivated to discredit him. If they could, eventually they would have discredited him. And it's not that he says that with apologetic intent. I think we often misunderstand what's going on in 1 Corinthians 15 as though he were presenting that creed as a way of persuading those to whom he is writing. He is not. They're already supposed to be persuaded of this. He's going on to show them consequences of it. And so this is supposed to be something that's already taken for common ground. So I don't really think that that claim is particularly doubtful. On the other hand, we have more direct evidence for the resurrection in the accounts in the Gospels. I know that it is customary in some circles to try to do without the Gospels, but I think that's a mistake. By far, our most detailed accounts are in the Gospels. By far, the most numerous small points of confirmation, as well as fascinating little differences that we can puzzle over, but that are common to all historical records, come up there. I'll just do a very quick riff on this. I've been reading military history recently, and in particular, the account of some of the military successes of Scipio Africanus. And there's one battle where Livy reports that Scipio took his a portion of his troops to the right, and he sent somebody else out with a portion to the left. But if you read Polybius, it has Scipio going to the left and Polybius to the right. Well, no big deal. I mean, it's a small thing. It could be accounted for on the plausible supposition that one person is talking about the right from the perspective of the Romans and the other from the perspective of the Carthaginians. But little differences like that are really a mark only that one source has not copied from the other. And so I really think the texture of the gospel evidence itself is the best place for us to repose the weight of the argument, even though I have, no problem, no doubt about the 500, but I would just prefer to put the weight of the argument somewhere else. Does that make sense?
Sure.
I would add to that something I like to do with the 500 is to connect it with the Gospels. So one way to do this, which is related to what I said a minute ago about evidence that we didn't take into account in our Blackwell article, is that Jesus did not solely appear to a really, really narrow group. Now, I don't think you could have fit 500 people into the upper room, but I do want to emphasize that in Luke 24, it says that the men from Emmaus, they came back and they spoke to the 11 and those who were with them. So it's right away implying a bigger group than the 11. And you find also the angels and Jesus are saying to the women, go tell my brothers to meet me in Galilee. Now, you can ask something like, well, if Jesus was going to see them that very night, he could carry his own message, right? And so that can even be taken to be some kind of contradiction with the narrative in Luke and in John, where he appears to them that very same day. They wouldn't have had time to walk to Galilee, obviously, in one day. But if we have an idea in mind, including perhaps the 500, of a larger group whom he was attempting to summon to Galilee and whom he was going to talk to in Galilee, that actually answers certain objections to the Gospels. Or similarly, in Matthew 28, he says that when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Now, in the verse immediately preceding that, it says the 11 proceeded to Galilee. And those, including, I'm sorry to say, some Christians who are trying to make some kind of conflict here or whatever, and who actually Dr. Lacona says this is the same appearance that is told in Jerusalem in Luke. And I just think that's completely wrong, and that Luke moved it to Jerusalem. And then the argument is, this is the 11. And the idea, I think, though unspoken, is that, well, the 11 wouldn't have doubted, because if this was a later appearance, they already had seen him on at least a couple of earlier occasions, if we try to harmonize with John. Well, okay, but what if, even though Matthew just says the 11, but what if it was a larger group? So once again, this notion of a larger group, which in that case appears to be outdoors, and you could get a much larger group together in the hills of Galilee. This is what John Wyndham thinks, helps us to explain the "but some doubted" part in Matthew. So I like that, even if you don't repose a lot of weight on its being exactly 500. And even though in 1 Corinthians it's not a detailed account, I have a great preference for detailed accounts. Still, when we bring that together with the allusions, the various allusions in the Gospels to a group of disciples larger than the 11, who had seen Jesus and interacted with Jesus personally while he was here on earth after his resurrection. And we even can use that to resolve alleged discrepancies in the Gospels. Then it takes on some really interesting weight and points us toward a larger body of attestation to the resurrection that goes beyond just multiplying or counting noses of the 11 or the 11 plus James or the 11 plus James and Matthias.
Excellent, thank you. Well, perhaps that's a good place to stop. So thank you to both of our guests, Dr. and Dr. McGrew. It's been great having you on. And sorry if your questions were not answered, but tune in next time we do such a webinar, and you can submit your questions there. Or if you are struggling with doubts, I'm happy to talk to you also. There's a forum on my website where I talk to people who are wrestling with intellectual doubts about their questions concerning the veracity of the Christian faith. So check that out as well. My website is jonathanmclatchy.com. So I will sign off here, and I'll see you guys soon. Don't forget, also in about 40 minutes, I'm doing a live stream with John Steingard, former singer of Hawk Nelson. This is going to be a follow-up conversation. We talked several months ago about his falling away from the Christian faith, and this is going to be a follow-up to find out about how his thinking has progressed since our last conversation, and to talk about some of our reasons for agreeing and disagreeing on these matters. So tune in for that also on this channel shortly. All right, I'll sign off now, and I'll see you guys soon.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.